Welcome to Next to Madison, a podcast to help you live your best life.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Next to Madison. On today's episode, I am talking with a fascinating individual. He is a neuro expert. He has studied the mind. He is trained at Harvard. He is an author. He is a speaker. He's actually the CEO of the Neuro Business Group. It's been said, and we've all heard, that all our problems really start in the mind. So if we can get our mind right, we can get our life right. So with that being said, I'm going to bring on my guest today next to me, or on the computer because of COVID. I would like to welcome Srini Pillay. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks, Madison. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Yes, thanks for doing this. So why don't we start with this? Tell the audience more about who you are and what makes you an expert in neuro.
Well, the who you are part's a little loaded, but I can tell you about what makes me an expert in neuro. So I'm a Harvard-trained psychiatrist. I'm also a brain imaging researcher. I've studied brains for 17 years at Harvard. I've been a clinician for more than 2 decades and continue to be a clinician. Okay. I've also worked in biotechnology across medicine: cancer, heart disease, stroke, and neurodegenerative disease. And I'm still working in biotechnology in those segments. I'm also a certified master executive coach. So I work in leadership development. And with leadership development, I work with leaders throughout the world. And I'm on a think tank at McKinsey, thinking about the future of learning within organizations. I'm also on the board of a company, of an organization called FRED, which is about ethical leadership within organizations, and the Transformational Leadership Council. And my most recent exploration has been being a co-founder and chief medical officer of a virtual reality company called Relay. That's actually a technology company that aims to to provide people with mindset shifts to decrease stress, because stress can change genes that opens up pathways for cancer, heart disease, stroke, and neurodegenerative disease. So we've launched that. And I'm also a musician, and I've written a musical recently. So I really think of myself as being at the nexus of science, art, and technology, and an explorer.
What do you not do?
A lot of things.
Yeah. That's great. And I want to talk about that key thing you said at the end, where stress, because you do hear and you read that stress can kill you, but you never knew why or how exactly. People just said, oh, well, you're stressed. How exactly does it change the chemistry of the brain that then leads to diseases?
Well, there are a lot of different mechanisms that are thought to, by which stress is thought to contribute to disease. One of the mechanisms that I'm looking at closely right now are mechanisms that are called epigenetics. And what we've learned is that stress can change genes. The processes are called methylation and histone modification. What that means is it adds a kind of toxic group to the gene, can alter the gene. And when it alters the gene, it can open up pathways to cancer, heart disease, stroke, and neurodegenerative disease that eventually hurts people.
Yes.
So so that's one mechanism. The other mechanism is that stress can also overactivate what we call the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Basically, there's a hormonal generator in your brain that stress can impact. And when stress impacts this effect can really spread throughout the rest of your body. So, I often say to people that I find it remarkable that in medicine, and this is something I'm invested in changing, so people think that all the organs in the body are separate, that your brain is here, and your heart is here, and your lungs are here, and your liver is somewhere else, and they are located in different places. But the reality is that the sperm and the ovum formed a single fertilized cell, and this became the rest of your body. So the rest of your body was always connected from the time you were born. And then this connection remains through nerves and through blood vessels, and the organs are constantly impacting each other. So even though we think of stress as something that impacts the brain, because the brain is connected to the rest of the body, illness, when it causes negative effects in the brain, this negative effect can actually spread to the rest of the body as well. So stress is something that I think, one of the things we're invested in. I'm, as I said, a co-founder of a company called Roulette, and one of the things we're trying to ask people to think about is gene care. Like, we brush our teeth on a day-to-day basis because we want to prevent dental caries. Why wouldn't we care for our genes on a day-to-day basis by building in these mindset resets to be able to manage stress so we don't release these diseases?
So what are some of those mindset reset tools?
So there are a lot of different ways in which we can think about this. I'll mention a couple, and you can tell me
Okay.
if you have any questions about them. So one of them is, what we know about stress and anxiety is that it can flood the anxiety center in the brain. And the anxiety center in the brain is connected to the thinking brain. So what we know from studies is there are ways in which you can have blood go away from the anxiety center back to the thinking brain. And there, I use a mnemonic that's defined by 5 letters. The mnemonic is CIRCA. So if anyone's listening to this, just to write down CIRCA. The
Okay.
first C is for chunking. So when you've got a huge stress, like let's say you're thinking about a stress in your relationships or with your finances, and you don't know how to actually resolve those. The C for chunking means, let me figure out what I'm going to do now and next week and the week after, rather than looking at this huge abyss of uncertainty where and this huge problem that you don't know what to do with.
Okay.
Then the I in CIRCA stands for ignore mental chatter. And
Mm-hmm.
what that is mindfulness. So studies show that if you focus on your breath and keep your attention on it like a flashlight, and if your mind starts wandering and it moves away, if you bring your attention back to your breath, this can actually have very positive effects on the anxiety center in your brain and can help to de-stress you. In fact, mindfulness in preliminary studies has been shown to protect genes and actually delay aging. Because at the tips of genes are these caps called telomeres. And usually as you get older, they get shorter and shorter. And mindfulness in preliminary studies has been shown to protect that. So
Wow.
the I, which is for ignore mental chatter, is that. Then the R is reality check, which is self-talk. So by reframing things, you can actually calm down the amygdala or the anxiety center in the brain. And so saying something like "this too shall pass" is something that your brain needs to hear sometimes, because when you're in the midst of a pandemic or you're in the midst of a relationship that's difficult to handle, at some point you're going to get to the end of that. So reminding your brain that you're going to get to the end of that can be helpful.
Yeah.
Then the second C is control check, which is like the serenity prayer. Like, what are we trying to control that is just taking up brain space? And is there a way that we're not going to do anything about? And then release that so that you have space to do stuff you want to do and stuff that you can do things with. And then the last A is for attention shift, which is, rather than focusing on the problem, how do I keep my attention focused on the solution? So CIRCA is chunking, ignore mental chatter, reality check, control check, and attention shift. And by using these different methods, studies show us that you can drive blood away from the anxiety center and help to calm down the brain.
That is like very well said and very helpful if you think about it that way, because there's a lot of uncertainty in people's lives right now, and maybe they're moving or thinking about relocating to a new city now, or a new job, or changing career paths, and there is so much kind of uncertainty. And one of the things that's always helped me is focusing on like what I can control. Like if I can't control it, then I should just let it go. But that took me years to figure out, because you try to control it, because when you feel you're controlling things, you feel you're in charge of them. Like you can fix them. But some things like you really can't. But you hear a lot that people just have anxiety, right? Like it's a mental disease. And a lot of people have it. A lot of people in my industry and the arts have anxiety. Do you think that this is something that is hereditary, or is it something that we contribute to over time through our thoughts?
It's actually both. So studies have shown that it's likely transmissible via genes.
Okay.
And but that's not probably not the major part of it. That as a result of the way we lead our lives, anxiety can be due to a number of different factors. So it could be due to trauma early on in life. It could be due to nutritional factors. It could be due to relationship factors. It could be due to social factors. So there are a number of different things that create this anxiety. I I mean, I have a slightly more philosophical view on that. I think anxiety is a natural consequence of investing in reality. So most people live their lives believing in their perceptions, right? So like if I said to you, what's reality? You'd be like, oh yeah, I see a window in front of me, I see some pictures around me, that's reality. But if we ask ourselves, well, but do our sense organs really give us an accurate picture of reality? It's like, well, you can't hear a dog whistle, and you can't hear, you can't see, you'll see a mirage when there's no mirage in a desert. So our senses do distort things. And
Mhm.
I think when we're constantly living as if reality is our boss, it can create a lot of anxiety. One thing I ask people to do as a mindset shift is, rather than reality determining your commitments, let commitments determine your reality.
Very well said.
So, for example, if you are someone who is wanting to be, if you're lonely and you want to be in a relationship, and you find yourself saying, "But I can't meet anyone, and it's a pandemic, and I'm not going to be able to see anyone. Like, what's going to happen?" It's like, well, that's the reality. And if you let reality determine your commitments, you're not going to get anywhere. So if
Sure.
your commitment is, I want to meet someone, and I want to meet someone despite the fact that there's a pandemic, or despite the fact that it's hard to meet people, now you know that your commitment is going to be your boss. So I always say to people, let your commitments be your boss and not reality.
That's great. And that could be with like a goal too. If you want to accomplish something, either start a business or produce a show, let that, even though reality might sit there and say, well, this isn't happening, this isn't going anywhere, say, no, I'm going to start this business. And then reality kind of dictates it around you. Like, how do
Yeah.
you shift your reality based on like your mindset of, I want to make this happen?
So there are a couple of different things I think you can think about when it comes to that. One of them is, I think a lot of people feel like they're really, they're not able to do what they want to do because their first attempt, it doesn't succeed. So they're like, okay, I want to make more money this year. And then you try to make more money, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, well, I guess I didn't find the job I wanted. I can't really do the startup I thought of. And you need some kind of confidence to help you build it. So there's a simple framework that I like to help people think about when they're building confidence. It's
Okay.
three things. The first is, when you're trying to build confidence, avoid using the word no or not when you're trying to frame your goal. So rather than saying, I do not want to spend too much money, you can say, I want to save money. And this is the theory behind it. Daniel Wegner, who was at Harvard, studied how the brain works under conditions of uncertainty. And what he found was that if you say do not do something, your brain does the exact opposite of that under conditions of uncertainty. So he studied soccer players, for example, with eye tracking devices. If you're about to score a penalty and you say do not kick the ball to the right, the eye goes to the right. And they actually found that with, and they describe this playfully in the context of, if you're walking across the room with a glass of wine in your hand, and you say, do not drop the wine near the white couch, inevitably you end up dropping the wine. Then you're like, what did I do? Like, I just told myself not to drop the wine. It
Yeah.
happened with relationships as well. If you say, I should not fall in love with somebody at work, the next thing you know, you're head over heels in love with it. So a simple trick is to say, avoid saying do not, like do not lose your temper, and instead say be calm. So that's principle number one for building confidence. Principle number two is, call out the negative emotion if you're having it, or any emotion. If you're afraid, when you label the emotion, it's called affect labeling, and it actually decreases activation of the anxiety center in the brain. So if you have an emotion, don't just leave it hanging out abstractly. actually sort of say to yourself, okay, what am I feeling? Call out the emotions, and even if it's mixed, call out the emotions. And the third thing is Ethan Kross and his colleagues have actually found that if you're trying to really sort of pump yourself up, let's say you've got a meeting that you've got to be confident about, or you have an investor meeting and you're trying to figure out, well, how do I really pump myself up? Rather than saying, I'm going to crush this, it's much more effective to call yourself by name. And if it were you, you'd say, Madison, you're going to crush this.
Yeah.
And the reason that works, you speak in the second person and call yourself by name, is the anxious part of you is saying to the rest of you, you're going to crush that. So by avoiding the word not, by labeling the emotion, and by speaking to yourself in the second person and calling yourself by name, you can actually build confidence that can allow you to get to your goals.
Interesting. That's very well said. So, because I think a lot of people, if they're going into like a big meeting, some sort of pitch meeting or something like that, would be nervous, and they would say something like, "Gosh, please pray this goes well," or "I hope this goes well," which can be the uncertainty, because you're not saying it is going to go well. You're saying, "I hope it goes well."
Right.
So, is that like another thing too that kind of goes under that?
Yeah, and I would say, there's a lot more to these. Like, I'm just offering frameworks, which I think can help, but I think it has to fit with the individual and their personality. A lot of people would advise in the situation of a pitch to go in being vulnerable rather than trying to be a know-it-all, because everybody knows nobody knows it all. So
Right.
if you go into a pitch and you're like, I know everything. Like I always say to people, I both believe and don't believe anything that I'm saying. And people are like, what are you talking about? The more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know and how
Yes.
science is constantly changing. So I offer frameworks based on research, but I really respect individuality. Like I think people need to be involved in this whole equation. If you just do something, it's not that helpful. Like, do you know, there's been a study done by someone named Marcus Creedy. People always say you've got to have grit and you've got to have perseverance. Well, Marcus Creedy looked at more than 60,000 people and found that actually grit doesn't play much of a role in success. Like sometimes people will say, you've got to do something over and over again. Well, Brooke McNamara at Princeton did studies, more than 10,000 people, and showed that deliberate practice contributes to work success less than 1%.
What?
So doing stuff, because there are a lot of people in the world who do stuff over and over again and never get anywhere. But if you ask someone who's successful, they'll be like, oh, it's because I worked so hard. Well, guess what? A lot of other people worked hard and they didn't get anywhere. So you really have to look beyond just your deliberate practice and grit and get to what I call a psychological center of gravity, like where you are expressing yourself fully, and you can get to that place where your success is integrated and embodied. I always say to people, you've got to feel it in your bones.
Yeah, very well said. So it's like you kind of believe it before you even maybe physically see it, before it enters your reality. It kind of goes back to that thing you were talking about previously.
Yeah, because if you commit to a possibility, right? Commitment, like possibility thinking, means you are switching from the pragmatic prefrontal cortex to the possibility circuit in the brain, which is called the default mode network. And the possibility circuit in the brain is a very powerful circuit that where you can commit to a possibility. And that doesn't mean you know what to do. It just means you're going to give your brain the information of what you're committed to so that that can then guide you and you let the future use you. So if you say,
okay,
if you say, well, I want to be an actor, it's like, well, anything that you come across in the job sector that's not about being an actor, it's like, well, sorry, you're not part of the future. I'm looking to let my future, my vision of myself as an actor, actually use me, which means that I'm going to maybe take acting classes. I'm going to interview for a lot of things. I'm going to sort of practice being centered in myself. I'm going to memorize passages. Once you do that, you start behaving like the thing that you want to be. And from a success standpoint, that's super important.
Right. It's a little act as if thing.
Yeah. It act as if and then become what it is you are trying to be. Like billionaires don't usually try to become billionaires. They behave like billionaires and then become that.
Okay, so that's a very interesting point, right? Because it is very hard, maybe when you're starting a business that eventually could make you a billionaire, but your credit cards are maxed out, you're in massive debt. How do you, when your reality is so bleak, act like a billionaire?
Well, as I said, reality should not be your boss. Your boss should be your sense of possibility.
That's a good example. That kind of drove that right home right there.
Yeah.
When you talk about money, people are like, huh?
Right. Yeah, so I think it's important to let possibility be your guide, because possibility in the brain can actually increase dopamine, so your brain feels really rewarded. And when you believe, you can achieve for the following reason. So if there was one study, I think Friedman was the author, who where they took 3 tubes of cream, and they were all the same cream, neutral cream. They
Okay.
labeled one lidocaine for pain relief. They
Uh-huh.
labeled one capsaicin, which is the active ingredient in chili, and they labeled one neutral. And it was all the same cream, all neutral. And they asked, well, what do you feel? People who took the lidocaine were like, wow, this feels really calming. People who took the capsaicin were like, oh, this stings. And
Yeah.
people who took neutral said nothing happened. And when you looked in their brains, people who actually took the lidocaine, the reward centers were activated. They expected something positive, so the brain actually cooperated with them. Whereas when you expect something negative from the capsaicin, the pain centers are activated. So a lot of times when you are believing in a possibility of something, you are activating the reward centers to have the motivation that you need. So when you do lose when your credit cards are maxed and you could lose your hope, you don't lose your hope because those dopamine circuits are firing and you're feeling rewarded because of your sense of possibility.
That's very well said. And I assume that you know some billionaires.
I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
How do they act differently than your other friends or peers?
So yeah, I mean, I think I know more millionaires than I know billionaires, but I do know a couple of billionaires. I would.
Yeah, billionaires are pretty rare, but
I think it's actually quite subtle. So one of the things is that I would say that a characteristic across the board is a relentless inspiration to act in the domain that they're interested in. Like they're so curious. Sometimes it's the most boring thing. Like to me, like it'll be like, what? Like you're inspired by creating software that allows insurance companies to process bills? Like what? Like how is this? Like you get up every day and you're like, oh, I want to think. But they are so turned on by their ideas that they don't stop. So when investors say no, they're like, well, it doesn't matter. So you're not part of my plan. And they go to somebody else. So rejection for them is simply a signal that they've got a course correct. Rejection is not a signal. I mean, sometimes they get sad, sometimes they get anxious, but I think that's one big characteristic. The other is that I think that most people I've met who fall in that category are very, they're not necessarily doing all of this positive thinking practice or trying to figure out 1, 2, 3. They often know, as Steve Jobs said, in life, you sometimes can't join the dots moving forward. You can join them looking backwards, but in Jobs's words, moving forward, you've got to believe in something, gut, karma, life, destiny, whatever. And
right.
so when you ask yourself, well, what is this gut, karma, life, destiny, whatever? For each person, that's different.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, and I'll talk about examples I can't talk about that were public as opposed to my clients, but
Right.
uh, Bernard Arnault is the founder of Louis Vuitton
Yeah.
and of LVMH. And he independently sort of raised this fortune and built this multi-brand conglomerate that's a luxury conglomerate.
Yeah.
And when you look at his story, one of the things he did was he invested in things he believed in. He liked the Bulgari brand, so he paid top dollar for that. He was a leader. Anna Wintour talks about this. He was a leader when it came to Sephora. Everyone was like, Sephora? Like, who's going to go to Sephora? And he just believed that it was possible. And his son it made a very interesting comment about him. And this, I think, will really ground the notion of what one of the characteristics of billionaires is.
Okay.
His son said, people think my father is some kind of financial tycoon, that he just pays attention only to how to make money and how to get profits. But he said, yeah, we have an operational part of the company, but we also have an inspirational part of the company. And my father is an expert at inspiring the people who are working for us to do their best jobs. And as a result, we have the most beautiful things. And that's because he has a genuine interest in art. So
Yeah.
I think leaders are often self-possessed. They are not committed to knowing, but they are committed to exploring, and they are committed to giving their all in the service of their own truth. You know, Warren Bennis, who has studied leaders over the years, I think gave one of the most profound definitions of a leader when he said that becoming a leader is synonymous with becoming yourself. It's precisely that simple and also that difficult.
That totally makes sense, because I feel like a lot of people, especially professionally, kind of put on a little bit of a show to fit in, or to not ruffle feathers, or because they don't want to lose their job or upset somebody, so they're not really their true selves.
Yeah, and we just look at examples of people. Like, look at Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and Bernie Arnault. Like, Bill Gates doesn't try to imitate Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett's not trying to imitate Jeff Bezos. You know, they're the only thing they imitate is being committed to their own mission. You know, that's and actually, I talk a bit about Bill Gates in my book Tinker Dabble Doodle Try, because one of the things I talk about is that in order to really maximize the use of your brain, your brain has to be in cognitive rhythm. You've got to go between focus and unfocus. Now, most people live their lives with focus fatigue.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't drive cross country without refueling your car. Why would you go across an entire day and just fatigue yourself? Why not focus, refuel, focus, refuel? And the more you do that, the more likely it is that you're going to be operating at a higher level through most of the day. And in the book, I talk about ways in which Bill Gates, for example, has taken time off regularly to be able to have this unfocused time. Steve Jobs went to an ashram and then suddenly found himself in the midst of that rest. You know, Albert Einstein talks about a moment of unfocus in his theory of relativity when he said his theory was like a musical perception. So if you build the ways to build unfocus into your day are things like napping, like 5 to 15 minutes of a nap will give you 1 to 3 hours of clarity. Now, you can't nap too much because it might set your sleep. But think about it. I mean, how often do we not just go through our days? I mean, haven't you found yourself sometimes saying, I'm just going to pull through this in the middle of the
or get another cup of coffee?
Yeah, exactly. And actually, there are studies that show that napping is superior to coffee. So
why don't more companies have nap rooms?
I think they should.
I don't think anyone has a nap room that I know.
No, Google has napping pods. Zappos has napping pods.
Okay.
I've actually written about this online. There are a bunch of companies that encourage napping. So
wow, but you can't really fall asleep for 5 minutes, but you're just laying there resting. So that's enough to be a nap.
Sometimes you can grab a cat nap, like 15 minutes of just like, I'm going to be out, and then you get up and you're so fresh. This doesn't work for everybody, but that's one of them. The other is, you know, drawing while someone's talking on the phone, for example. If you just draw pictures of what they're talking about, it can improve your memory. So it can be really helpful to be in that unfocused state. The other is there's a thing called positive constructive daydreaming.
Okay.
Which was discovered by Jerome Singer in the 1950s. And what he said was that sitting at your desk and daydreaming is not that helpful. But, and also, like, you know, revisiting the prior night's indiscretions, maybe you had too much to drink, like that's not helpful. But what is helpful is if you do positive constructive daydreaming. And what that is you set aside 20 minutes when you know you're going to be tired. So let's say, you know, directly after lunch or the middle of the afternoon, you set aside that time, and then you must be doing something low key. So you do something like knitting, gardening, or walking, and then you just let your mind wander. And when you do this, it activates the default mode network. And as a result, a lot of important and hidden memories can be found, and they come together, and you have these aha moments. You know, like how sometimes people say, like, I get my best ideas in the shower, like not when
Yeah.
I'm staring at something. I mean, have you had that experience? Like with
Oh, of course. Sometimes, like, with comedy, I'll have my, best ideas when I'm just out having a fun conversation or walking on a beach or having some drinks. And that's where the best stuff. But if you sit in front of the computer, it's like your mind just is not as creative, is open, because you're thinking like, I have to do this type thing. So it really just kind of depends.
Yeah, I agree with that. And you're mentioning comedy makes me think that humor is such a therapeutic modality, right? Humor could really heal the brain, it
Yeah.
can reward the brain. I just think simple things are missing from our lives these days, like humor,
I,
beauty, deliciousness. Like
yeah.
sometimes I love food and I love tasty food, and I love healthy food, but I don't always love healthy food when
Right.
it's not tasty. And so I just think there's simple corrections you can make to your everyday life. If you're feeling like, oh my God, like what is this guy talking about? How are you going to do all these things? I think everybody has to figure out some way to start. And you can have a lofty goal, but so as not to feel discouraged, take small steps and start initiating changes to your life.
Yeah.
And the truth is, people who are committed to making changes will at least they put themselves in a position to change. It's like you can't win the lottery if you don't buy a lottery ticket. Like,
That's exactly right. So let's talk about some kind of social scenarios that everybody goes through, and why our brain or our mind is our worst enemy when it comes to these things, right? So we'll talk
yeah,
about everyone's favorite topic, which is relationships. Let's say you're a single person and you're out there and you're going to go on a date, or you're going to be at a party where there's but before you even meet that person, there's 100 scenarios that play in your mind that sabotage a possible relationship. Or, why would I talk to that person? He's too hot for me. He'll probably just break my heart. Why do we do that? And how do we fix that?
well, in terms of why we try to tell ourselves, why we try to prepare for disappointment,
Yeah. Always.
um,
Yeah.
I think it's because we want to be good at it. Like we want to be good at handling disappointment. So a
Yeah.
very profound experiment that was done around this was when Freud watched babies in their cots. And one of the things he and a bunch of other people did was they looked at the babies and they were like, okay, this is a weird behavior. Like, why do babies throw their toys out? Like, if I came to your house in the middle of the day, you wouldn't be like throwing your possessions out. Like, why do you? It's kind of like a strange behavior. And then they're like, wait a minute, now they're crying. They're like, you threw your own things out, and now you're crying. And then
Hmm.
the mother brings the toys back, and then they're like, oh, I'm so happy. They're like, okay, this is like a little like cuckoo. Like, what is going on here? And the next thing you know, the baby throws the toy out again. They're like, okay, this is just a strange behavior. Like, what? First of all, why are you throwing your stuff out? Then you're crying. Then we give it back to you, and you're happy, and you throw it out again. And then they had a pretty profound realization. They realized that actually adults are wired like babies to master disappointment and not to seek fulfillment. So so many people
Wow.
so many people go into relationship situations because they want to be really good at the fact that life is so terrible. They're like, look at me, like I went in, I got rejected, but I'm okay. Like so many people are
Right.
just, they're not like, let me seek something that's going to be fulfilling. They're like, let me do the same thing. I'm going to date the same guy or
Yeah.
the same girl, like over and over again, because I'm going to make this work. But underneath that is this feeling of, this time my heart's not going to be broken. I'm used to you. I know what this is like. And it's like once you get caught up in that habit pathway, and stress actually turns on habit pathways in the brain, you want to actually distance yourself from the worrying that you talked about. Like if you're going to go on a date and this person is hot or not hot, I mean, just like before that, just say to yourself, do I know any couples who just look completely mismatched? Just walk on the street and there are like hundreds of couples who are mismatched. So
Right.
notion, this notion that people are only with people who are exactly as good looking as they are is kind of an absurd assumption. It's
Right.
just trying to convince yourself that you couldn't. And also, people of depth, they can understand that there are many appealing things about a person, and that they may not prioritize a look in a certain way. They may prioritize the way the other person makes them feel.
Yeah.
They may prioritize long-term relationships. So they might meet someone who's sort of, unbelievably attractive, and then say, well, like, what do I want to do? Like, do I want to deal with this for the rest of my life? Is it going to be a headache? I think people make too many assumptions before they get to know somebody. And I think we all need to remember that everyone you're meeting is not opening up their hearts on the first date.
No,
Like,
right.
like everyone you're meeting is essentially, say, cautiously observing you. And the question is whether you can give yourself a chance to discover the other person and to let them discover you. That's really the basis of relationships. One of the things we know
Yeah.
about social rejection is that social rejection can turn on physical pain pathways in the brain. It's the same, it's overlapping.
Yeah.
So that's why people hate the idea of rejection. They're like, oh, it almost hurts your body. It's so horrible. But
Right.
my general feeling about this, though, is that I think people who remain committed to their vision of a relationship are often successful at it. Not determined, not desperate, but committed. Because remember, we have mirror neurons in our brains, and so studies have shown that if I look at you like that, your brain is going to start creating that kind of activation and that expression. Whereas if I smile, then you're going to feel the way I feel, and that's because you have a system of neurons in your brain that literally mirror not just my actions. Like if I went like this, your brain would create exactly that activation with sub-threshold. Similarly, if I feel something, you're gonna feel it automatically. So if you go up to a date and you're like, oh my God, this person's gonna hate me, this person's gonna hate me, in that brain of the other person, it's gonna be, oh my God, this person's gonna hate me, this person's gonna hate me. You are mirroring your emotion unintentionally in the other person's brain. So I always tell people, if you're afraid, go into a situation and counter mirror. So, like I do this sometimes with, I'll say, look, what do you love? And sometimes people will be like, oh, I love the sound of babies gurgling. It's like, okay, go to a YouTube video, go look at a baby gurgling, and they're like, I feel so great. So like, well, look at it 2 minutes before you go on the date. You go on the date and you're like, oh my God, it's so great to see you, because you don't say, I'm so high from looking at beautiful babies gurgling, but the person's like, it's such an upbeat person. Like, how did this happen? And then they feel upbeat, and then all of a sudden you're connected. So we can do things to mirror different emotions before dates. And why go into a date mirroring a negative emotion? Because even if that person liked you, it's going to neutralize that. And they're going to start to be, if you're nervous, they're going to be like, oh my God, I'm nervous. Like, why am I nervous?
Right. Exactly. So why do you think so many people, and we'll talk about this in two different areas, but right now with relationships, self-sabotage? Like a relationship's going well and they just, I guess they're afraid it's going to end, so they figured if they rip the band-aid off faster, they won't have fallen as deep. Why do people tend to do that? And then we'll shift from there to success, like money.
So, I mean, a lot of reasons. I think one of the things, two of the constructs underlying that are fear of failure, and the
Okay.
other is fear of success. Because the whole thing about fear of success is like, if I commit, like a lot of people think they want a relationship, but they're actually ambivalent about commitment. So they're like, oh my God, I totally want to, they love the chase. They're like, I want to be after, and I want this person to say they love me. But no, not too close, too fast. And then
Yeah.
all of a sudden, they're chasing that person away. So I think that people generally have a lot of ambivalence that they need to really sort out before they enter a relationship situation. Because I think when you enter that relationship situation, you want your mind to be relatively clear. Now, when it comes to self-sabotage, fear of failure also makes people feel like, well, if the bad thing's going to happen, why don't I just make it happen now? Because I don't want to tolerate that feeling of worry,
Yeah.
or I want to keep on worrying. People who worry are interesting because when I used to run the anxiety disorder service at McLean Hospital, I would see a lot, and I would be like, what is going on? Like, worried people often are very endearing. They worry about everything. Like, I don't know if my child's okay. Do they eat enough? What's going to happen to the world? They're worried about everything.
Right.
And you're like, what is motivating this person to live in a state of continuous worry? And then you realize that when you tell worried people to stop worrying or to become, it's one of the worst things you can say. Like, I never said that after a couple of meetings. Like, oh, there's no need to worry. They're like, what are you talking about? Because
Right.
worried people rely on worry energy because they have what we call contrast avoidance. So in life, you have peak experiences and you have trough experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And what worried people do is they keep themselves in the middle. So if something bad happens, someone dies, they lose something, they don't have to fall from ecstasy to sadness. They fall from worry to sadness, and the drop is not as much. So a lot of people keep on generating the self-sabotage to keep themselves in a state of worry because they don't want the contrast of ecstasy with that. The other relates to what I just talked about earlier, the repetition compulsion, which is mastery over disappointment. People self-sabotage because they have this mastery. They want to have mastery over disappointment rather than seeking fulfillment. And it's complex. I'm obviously to a certain extent trivializing this. I think most people consciously don't want to hurt themselves. They want things to work out, but the unconscious brain plays a huge role in what we're doing. Sometimes people self-sabotage because, like, I have someone I'm seeing right now, and she's amazing on every level as a human being. But she has a huge problem with relationships, in part because she hasn't addressed the ambivalence she has about her parents' relationship. And she's like, she doesn't really like her father. She loves her mother. And she's saying to herself all the time, like, who wants that as an outcome? And so for her, every time she meets someone, she's anticipating that that's going to be the outcome, as opposed to having a fresh look, being like, those are my parents. I cannot like that. And I can build something different than what I'm exposed to.
Right. Because a lot of people are very affected by their parents in all aspects of their lives. Typically children of divorced parents will get divorced themselves. Like you kind of see that pattern happen. So that's really the key, is like, how do you kind of break that? And the thing you talk about fulfillment versus like people just in the worry state or what they kind of know. What are tips to make sure you're seeking fulfillment?
Well, one of the things is to build deliberately fulfilling activities into your life, regardless. So, like we talked earlier about like this snow and it's like, well, I have dinner plans tomorrow, and that's what I'm committed to. And if you look forward to that the whole week, in some way, because you're going to meet a good friend and you're going to have a fun time,
Yeah.
it's just a nice thing to look forward to. If you just wait for life to give you a moment to be fulfilled, you'll be waiting for your entire life. So I always say to people, try to build, when it's appropriate, a massage, a great walk, a visit to the museum, just walking around the city. Choose a time in your day, at least 2 to 3 times a week. Because honestly, I can't tell you how many people I've seen over the years who end up saying, like, where did my life go to? Like, I spent all my life worrying about having a relationship, getting wealthy, all these things that I'm supposed to be. And I forgot about the fact that I can actually have a pretty good time by myself. Like they don't need to be by themselves, but if you don't take care of your own happiness and you rely on other people to give you fulfillment, you're going to find that the years have passed and all of a sudden you don't really have anything to show for it. So
Yes.
I'm a big believer in fun. I like spiritual ideas like meditation, for example, which I think can be really helpful. But one of the reasons in my Twitter profile, I describe myself as somewhere between martinis and meditation, because I like both of those things.
Yeah.
It's a like I feel, in the right context, both of those things can be so much fun. And if you don't build that fun for yourself in your life, you're just going to be waiting endlessly for someone to do that for you.
Right. So kind of, maybe making a list of the things that make you happy, like
Yeah.
exercising or massage or walking your dog or being with friends, and making sure you're doing those things.
Yeah, and remember the possibility guide as well, because if you are committed to a possibility that is expansive and elated, usually that possibility, you'll notice where that possibility is. Like I find for example, if I am in a super like amazing mood, just looking at the snowfall can feel like the most magical elevated thing. And if I'm in a kind of foul mood, it's like, the snow. It's like, it's like
Right.
your mood determines how you view the exact same thing. So can you imagine if you make yourself happy and you go out and you meet someone, for example, they're going to feel like you will see them in that light. But if you are just miserable, you're going to see everything through the lens of misery. And you're going to be like, oh my God, here's a miserable person. Here's a miserable outcome. This is not going to work. So I don't advocate, falsifying positive states. But what I do advocate is a genuine engagement with the gift of being alive. I truly feel like it's a magnificent thing to be alive, and there's so much magic around. Like you don't have to look for unusual things. Like if I think about my own experience in this, I feel like I came from relatively nothing, and we had so much happiness because there was a moment, like having popcorn was like an incredible thing. It's like, how can you be so happy having popcorn? Well, if you like popcorn, you're going to be that happy.
Right.
Like, there's the simple things in life. Somebody actually pointed this out in a video I was watching where they said a lot of people say, well, if you think about the way your day is, right? What do? Well, you get up, you take a shower, you brush your teeth,
Right.
you put on your clothes, you have lunch, you have dinner. They're like, well, why don't you pay attention to those things? And most people are like, well, I'm not going to pay attention to that. It's like, well, that's 50% of your day. Like 50% of your day is like routines. So why not have the best shower? Like, like every time you go to the shower, you're like, oh my God, I have like my favorite soap. Like I have, it's going to be like a moment, and I'm exaggerating it, but I actually think you can have this relationship with life. You can have a relationship with life that feels inspired. I think people are afraid to be manic about this. They're like, well, I don't want to be too happy because if I'm happy, people will knock me down from that happiness. But, my general experience is life knocks you down regardless. So
This is true.
you might as well be happy when you can be happy.
Yeah, exactly. So let's see what else I want to kind of cover. So yeah, we've I guess the last thing I want to kind of focus on is you talked a lot about confidence and how that can help you in all areas of your life. Can you give us some more tips besides just the removing the no and the do not,
Sure.
that help build confidence, because that can go to all areas of our life?
Yeah, so the next level of thinking about confidence is really what I call existential confidence, and it's a type of confidence that I've studied with Jim Selman. He and I, over the last few years, have really been looking at this deeply, trying to understand. Aside from like I'm going to feel good, like pumping yourself up. How do you? What are some of the things? Well, some of the things are things I've already mentioned, like committing to a possibility that's not yet a reality, like letting the future use you. But one big piece is creating problems worth solving. Like we get up every day and we're putting out fires, right? Open your email, you're like, oh my God, put out fire, 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 fire. And that's that.
Yeah,
But when you actually think about it, why don't you just become the problem creator? Like, why don't you just say,
that's
how
interesting.
about, how about I just create problems that I truly want to solve? And if I want to solve this, I'm going to solve it. So, Elon Musk talks about this when he talks about how people live their lives. He said, you can't be spending your whole day solving problems. you want to also be inspired by something you care about. Like when somebody asked him about why he built the Hyperloop, he said, like a quick train from San Francisco to LA. He said, well, what am I going to do? Build something that's already been built in Japan? Like, I'm not going to want to get out of bed to build something that's not inspiring. So I think that the ability to do that is super important. I think the second thing that I would emphasize is also navigating without control. Now, remember, the basis of existential confidence is the ability to have faith in the possibility that you've committed to without the expectation that there's violence and despair lurking around every corner. And when I say this to people, they're like, well, you're clearly not attached to reality, because there is violence and despair. Like, everyone's dying, everyone's getting hit, everyone's getting killed. Like, what world are you living in? And I said, it's not about denying the reality. It's about not living in the expectation of that reality. Because when you live in the expectation of a better life, your brain will direct you toward that. But if you say to your brain, life's kind of horrible, so if you come across something horrible, just ignore it, you will keep on going through horrible things, and your brain will not be paying attention to the stuff you want to pay attention to. So I think existential confidence, the commitment to a possibility that is not yet a reality, that allows you to let the future use you so that you can create problems worth solving and simultaneously navigate without control. Like, when you're out at sea and you're in a sailboat, there's an amazing thing about putting up the sails and sailing.
Right.
And why in life are we always trying to control everything? Like, sometimes it's nice to just go for a walk. Yeah, maybe you'll meet someone. Maybe someone else will have a dog with them and they'll start talking to you and you'll talk to them. But you can just go out because it's a great day. And the idea of navigating without control, putting yourself in these places to really harness the benefits of serendipity, is one of the greatest gifts you can give to yourself. One thing I do caution against is this notion of loving yourself. I always find that really weird. I remember once in a...
Explain more of that, because you hear that all the time. You got to love yourself first before you can love anybody else.
Well, I had somebody teach me that, a client once, when I was talking to her about this early in my career, and I said something about loving yourself, and she said, okay, like, no more of this. And I was like, what do you mean? She goes, I don't want to love myself. I want someone else to love me. Do you know what I mean? Like, if you're going to tell me to love myself, it's so boring. And I kind of don't believe it. Like, I don't want to be a self-contained unit. I want someone else to love me. And I remember at the time, it really hit home. I was like, like people will sometimes say, like, sometimes I'll have a few pounds more. I'll be like, oh God, I wish I need to lose a little weight. People are like, well, how do you feel? I was like, nothing. I get out of the shower. I don't love myself. I don't hate myself. I just dry up and move on. Like, and then I'm aware that I got to lose a couple pounds. So I'm like, okay, like, figure out how you're going to do it. I'm not going to do it the usual way because I like food too much. And so I have to figure out, well, how would I exercise? What sports do I like to play? How am I going to integrate that? But I think this whole idea of loving yourself is odd. The problem with loving yourself is that you split yourself into two all the time. You have an experiencing self and an observing self. And the moment you are dyadic, the moment you are not one whole, you cannot be at peace. So loving yourself is splitting yourself in two. The way to really love yourself is to recognize that you are part of the greater whole. That paradoxically, loving yourself is not about turning your attention inward, but recognizing that you're connected. I mean, it's a pretty profound reality that we're connected, right? I mean, if you think about it, like you think your brain is in your head, right? And I think my brain is in my head. And you think your body is your body and mine is mine. And everyone we know around us is separate from us. But think about this. If our bodies could really live alone, why, if you look at solitary confinement research, do people in solitary confinement have 31% higher rates of hypertension? Why do they have 24% higher rates of mortality in the first year compared to other prisoners? Why, if you're lonely, Do you get calcification of the coronary arteries? Do you get left ventricular hypertrophy? Your body cannot really survive when it's unplugged from the rest of the universe. And self-love at its deepest level is understanding that you have this body, but all of us, in my mind, metaphorically, are like beads on a chain of consciousness. And the chain of consciousness is what unites all human beings, all things around the world. And if you can just live into that, like right now, these days, there's a lot of polarized narrative. Let's look at this group, let's look at that group. It's like there's some value to that when you're trying to establish equity up to a point. But the truth is, nobody who wants to actually be included needs to feel like someone did them a favor by inviting them to the party. Like if someone was like, let me invite you to the party. Like, I'm gonna do you a favor. How would you feel, Madison? Like a special favor for you. I don't really want you to be there, but I'm gonna do it because it's the right thing. Like, you're not gonna want to go to the party.
Right.
So I believe that we will foster greater connection if we recognize what for me is an ultimate truth, which is that love is our way. Love is about this connection that all of us are joined by. And self-love is really about recognizing that you're part of the greater whole. It's not about saying, I love myself in a certain way, because, we all feel good on a certain day. Like you might say, oh, I look better today than on another day. Or, you get something, you're like, yes, that's awesome. But I think it's a tall order to get out of bed every day, look at your face in the mirror and being like, I love you. Like, that's just not a conversation I want to have with myself. Like,
right. It's a weird feeling too. You're like, right. I liked how you said, you're like, I don't hate myself. I'm just myself. Like
right.
I'm going about, this is what I was given. I'm going to appreciate what God gave me and move on with my life and do the best I can.
Yeah.
Thing. So I think that was very well said. And I've also heard this where, and you're going to verify that it's true, hopefully. And it's a scary reality that your thoughts have contributed to exactly where you are and everything you have experienced in your life.
Yeah, I think on many levels that's true. I mean, I think there are some caveats to that, like where the thoughts come from, because sometimes that energy has contributed to that. But very often, I think, so what are thoughts? Thoughts are information to your brain. They're simply like, here's where to go, or here's who I am. So if you say to your brain, I'm a victim who's never going to be happy and I'm never going to get the money that I actually truly want, your brain's going to be like, okay, cool. Now I know who you are. Like, no sweat. Let's just hang out. We'll sit on the couch. We'll do nothing. And then you're like, why am I getting nowhere? It's like, you just told your brain who you are. Like,
right.
That you don't have power, and the first biological level of this is what I said about mirroring. It's like, if you've got a negative intention in you and you meet someone, it's going to mirror in their brain and you're going to get that right back. So in that sense, your thoughts do get you what you put out. But it's also true that how we conceptualize, it's been shown with growth mindset literature. Carol Dweck has studied this. And she has actually said, and they've shown in many occasions, that when you believe that your mind is malleable, that it's changeable, that no matter what, you can always get better with a certain amount of effort, you actually end up being much more successful. But if you believe that your capacities are fixed, which is really not true, like the brain can change, it's called neuroplasticity, your capacities are not fixed. But when you believe they're fixed, you actually don't do well. They've done these studies on girls, for example, with mathematics, where if you tell a group of girls that they're amazing at math, they do as well as boys. But if you just leave them to default to the social norm, people are like, well, girls are like artists and, boys like math. But that's not true. Like, there are also boy artists and there are girl mathematicians. And,
right.
And, so you don't need to trap yourself with the stereotype. You can transcend that by really just not, by being unbounded.
Yeah, no, that's very well said. Absolutely. So before we wrap up, I want you to tell everybody where they can find you and where they can purchase your books. I know you have a book that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, well, so my latest book is Tinker, Dabble, Doodle, Try, Unlock the Power of the Unfocused Mind. And in it, I explain why sometimes doing less is doing more, and what are the strategic ways that you can do less to be able to enhance your intelligence, your creativity, and your energy.
Oh,
So
okay.
that can be found really on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, or at your local bookstore. So it's a book I'm very invested in because I feel like so many people are doing the exact opposite, exhausting themselves
Yes.
rather than figuring out how to strategically build these breaks into their lives. And I think now especially is the time where people can learn how to do this to protect their brains. So
Yeah,
thanks.
absolutely. Absolutely. And what's your website so people can read more about you as well?
I have a couple. One is drsrinipillay.com, DRSRINIPILLAY.com, and then also nbgcorporate.com. So N as in Nancy, B as in boy, G as in girl, corporate.com. And that's my website for leadership development. And the other is how I interact with the general public.
Oh, well, that is fantastic. And I also wanted to mention, I meant to mention this at the beginning, pretty impressive, actually very impressive. You were voted top 20 movers and shakers in the leadership development world. I
Yeah,
mean,
thank you.
that's amazing because there's a lot of leadership coaches out there and life coaches and self-help development. So to be in that top 20 is really, I feel honored to have been able to talk to you. I wish I had like a whole weekend retreat with you to be like, why am I thinking this?
Thank you. No, it's a lot of fun talking to you, and I really love and appreciate your curiosity and also what you're wanting to do for people in the world. I firmly believe that we're living in an era where the next level of brilliance is going to come from collaboration. So I see you as a collaborator in the grand mission of transformation. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. So you guys, yeah, definitely, you can go to the website nexttomadison.com. All the links to Dr. Pillay's information is going to be there, so you can easily find that in one spot. And yeah, thanks for listening to another episode of Next to Madison, and we'll see you guys next time to find out who's next.
Hey, your host here, Madison Malloy. Please make sure to subscribe to the show on all podcast platforms, and please rate and review us on iTunes and Spotify. Also, if you have any questions or comments, you can email us at contact@nexttomadison.com. I thank you again for listening. Bye.